The last day of death row. Inmate Melissa Lucio coerced confession or cold-blooded crime. Hello friends, tonight we turn to Texas, where the story of Melissa Lucio has divided an entire nation. In 2007, her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah, was found lifeless, and within a year, Melissa was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. For nearly 14 years, she has waited on death row, and if carried out, her execution would mark the first time in more than a century that a Mexican-American woman has been put to death in this state. But what makes this case so haunting is not only the crime itself, but the questions that still linger. Was Melissa a violent mother who caused her daughter's death, or a broken woman caught in a system that failed her and her children at every turn? Supporters call her innocent, critics call her guilty, and Texas says her time has run out. Stay with me, and subscribe now to Deathwatch Diaries for more prison documentary stories you won't forget. Melissa Elizabeth Lucio was born in 1968, raised in a household marked by poverty and instability along the border region of Texas. From a young age, she was exposed to violence. Family members later revealed that she was abused repeatedly, starting at age 6. Experiences that left her with deep scars that shaped much of her adult life. As she grew older, she fell into unstable relationships, many of them violent. By her early 20s, she was struggling with substance abuse, particularly cocaine. Melissa became a mother to 14 children. Life was far from stable. Some of the children were already grown by 2007, while others were still very young. Social workers had flagged concerns for years about neglect and unsafe living conditions, and at times, Child Protective Services stepped in to remove children from her care. But despite these interventions, the cycle of hardship continued. By early 2007, Melissa and her family were living in poverty, trying to piece together life one day at a time. On February 17, 2007, tragedy struck. 2-year-old Mariah, Melissa's youngest daughter, was found unresponsive. Melissa told authorities that Mariah had fallen down a flight of stairs 2 days earlier. She claimed the little girl had stumbled and tumbled from the top, and that the family had done their best to care for her afterward. But when Mariah was brought to the hospital, doctors saw injuries that told a different story. The emergency room physician who examined her declared it to be the worst case of child abuse he had seen in 3 decades of practice. Mariah's tiny body was covered in bruises. Her arm had been broken weeks earlier and never treated, and her head showed severe trauma. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head, insisting that such injuries could not have come from a single fall downstairs. For investigators, the explanation of an accident didn't add up. Melissa was taken into custody the night her daughter died. What followed has become one of the most contested parts of her case, a long interrogation by Texas Rangers. For over 5 hours, without a lawyer present, Melissa was questioned relentlessly into the early morning hours. At times, she denied harming Mariah. At other points, exhausted and distraught, she said words that sounded like an admission. "I guess I did it. I'm responsible." Supporters say this was a coerced confession, the product of a battered woman syndrome that made her vulnerable to manipulation. They argue she was simply agreeing with authority figures to end the questioning, not confessing to murder. Prosecutors, however, argued that those words revealed the truth, that Melissa had finally admitted what she had done. In 2008, her case went to trial in Cameron County. Prosecutors presented the autopsy photos, the testimony of doctors, and Melissa's own words during interrogation. They also painted a broader picture, a woman who had given birth to 14 children, many of whom had allegedly suffered neglect or abuse. Witnesses, including family members, testified to a pattern of violence. The defense argued that Melissa was overwhelmed, impoverished, and struggling with addiction, but not a killer. They pointed to the possibility that one of her older children may have caused Mariah's injuries. But for the jury, the weight of the evidence fell against her. They unanimously found Melissa guilty of capital murder, and just a month later, she was sentenced to death. Melissa's years on death row were marked by both silence and noise. Silence in the cold routines of the prison, where she spent 23 hours a day in a cell. Noise in the debates outside, where her case drew more and more attention over the years. In 2020, the documentary The state of Texas verbers Melissa aired, casting her as a victim of injustice. It argued that she was railroaded by prosecutors, denied proper defense, and condemned based on a coerced confession and circumstantial evidence. The film sparked rallies, petitions, and calls from celebrities, lawmakers, and activists urging Texas to stop the execution. Supporters highlighted her history of abuse, her struggles with addiction, and the fact that the prosecutor who handled her case, Armando Villalobos, was later convicted of corruption in unrelated cases. But the other side was just as loud. Opponents argued that Melissa was guilty, that the injuries to Mariah spoke for themselves, and that her confession, however obtained, matched the facts. They pointed to the testimony of the ER doctor and medical examiner, who both insisted this was no accident. They noted that even if Melissa had not delivered the fatal blow, she allowed her child to suffer with untreated injuries and failed to get help. For them, she was guilty not only of action, but of neglect. As April 27, 2022 approached, Melissa's final 24 hours became the center of national attention. Supporters flooded social media with hashtags, held vigils, and pleaded for clemency. Her legal team submitted appeals, arguing her mental state made her confession unreliable, and pointing out that her trial attorneys had failed to call crucial witnesses, including her own children, who could have testified about the fall. Inside the prison, Melissa faced her last day with the quiet resignation of someone who had spent 14 years waiting. She was 53 years old. Guards kept her under close watch in a holding cell near the execution chamber in Huntsville. Visitors were permitted her family, her children, and spiritual advisors came to say goodbye. For Melissa, it was time to reflect on the choices, the tragedies, and the system that brought her here. In her last interviews, she expressed sorrow for Mariah. "I failed her," she said softly. "I failed her in many ways." Whether that was a confession of guilt or an acknowledgement of her inability to protect her daughter remains a matter of interpretation. Her last meal request was modest, a simple comfort rather than extravagance. As the evening drew near, the witness room filled with journalists, officials, and representatives of the victim's family. Across the state, people waited to see if Texas would carry out the execution of the first Mexican-American woman in its history. Then came a dramatic turn. Just days before the scheduled execution, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a stay. They ruled that new evidence, including testimony that her confession may have been coerced and expert disagreements about the cause of Mariah's injuries, needed to be considered. Melissa Lucio was not executed on April 27, 2022. Instead, she remained on death row, her fate once again uncertain. The case of Melissa Lucio remains one of the most polarizing stories in Texas death row history. For some, the evidence is clear. A child suffered injuries no accident could explain, and a mother failed in her most sacred duty. For others, Melissa is a victim herself, shaped by years of abuse and poverty, punished for being broken in ways the system never tried to mend. Dear friends, her final 24 hours became a symbol of something larger than one woman's fate. They reflected the uncertainty of justice itself. With a last-minute stay halting her execution, the question lingers, was Texas about to carry out an irreversible mistake? Or was it simply delaying an outcome the jury had already decided years ago? In either case, a little girl named Mariah is gone, and her loss remains at the heart of this tragedy. Share your thoughts below, and subscribe to Deathwatch Diaries for more prison documentary stories.